I want to tell you about the Tuesday I climbed onto my neighbor's roof with a toolbox, a thermos of coffee, and absolutely no idea that I was about to spend the next 3 months becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. That's the thing about the moments that flip your life sideways. They never come with a warning label. They come dressed as a busted tile and a woman standing in her driveway with her arms crossed, personally offended by the weather. Her name was Lola. 43, divorced, the kind of woman who holds eye contact just a beat longer than comfortable, and somehow makes you feel like you're the one who looked away first. I'd lived next door to her for 6 months. In that time, we'd exchanged exactly 4 words, 2 hellos and 1 sorry about the recycling bin. She had the energy of someone running an extremely efficient operation with no vacancy for additional variables. I respected that. I am also an additional variable, which would become relevant. The storm hit on a Monday night. By 7 Tuesday morning, I was outside cataloging the damage to my own gutters when I saw her standing in the driveway, staring up at her roof with the specific stillness of someone doing math they don't like. 2 tiles loose, 1 completely gone. A soft spot near the edge that I could identify from 30 feet away because I've been fixing things for a living since I was 19, and roofs talk to you if you know how to listen. I offered to take a look. She accepted with the graciousness of someone who had already spent 2 hours on hold with her insurance company and had nothing left to perform. What I did not calculate, standing at the base of that ladder, was that the damage was going to take 3 weeks. I also did not calculate Jade, Lola's 20-year-old daughter, who appeared on day 2 and looked at me like I was a problem she had already categorized and filed. But the thing I really didn't calculate was what Lola said that first afternoon, shielding her eyes against the sun as I came down the ladder. Completely straight-faced, like she was reporting the weather. If I were 18 years younger, I'd ask you out just for doing this. I laughed. She didn't. She went back inside. And I stood at the base of that ladder for a beat longer than necessary, trying to figure out why that sentence was still rattling around in my head 20 minutes later. If you're already in, subscribe and drop a comment. Have you ever offered to help someone and immediately known you'd gotten yourself into something much larger? Because I have now. I have extensive notes. The ladder was mine. The roof was hers. The coffee, that first morning, was also mine. I'd brought it from home because I didn't think to ask, and she didn't offer. That detail matters later. I was up there by 7:30. Assessing damage I could already tell was going to take longer than a single day, making mental lists of materials while the neighborhood slowly woke up around me. There is something clarifying about being 12 feet above a problem. Everything looks more solvable from a roof. Lola came out at 8 with a glass of water, not coffee, water, which told me she'd grabbed the first thing available rather than thought about it. She held it up from the driveway. I came down and took it. We stood there for a moment in the particular awkwardness of 2 people who don't know each other trying to be useful to each other. She asked how bad it was. I told her. Worse than it looked from the ground, better than it could be. She nodded like she was logging that into a spreadsheet and went back inside. Day 2 was when Jade showed up. I heard a car, looked down, saw a young woman pulling a backpack from the back seat with the practiced efficiency of someone returning from college for a long weekend. She dropped the bag on the porch, looked up at me, and performed a very specific kind of stillness, the kind that means someone is thinking faster than they're moving. I waved. She did not wave back. She went inside. Through the open kitchen window, I heard voices, low and indistinct, and then silence. Lola came out 20 minutes later to ask if I needed anything. There was a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before. I told her I needed another box of nails and a sheet of plywood, 42 inches. She wrote it down on her phone, went to the hardware store, and came back 45 minutes later with exactly what I'd asked for, plus a bottle of water she handed up the ladder without comment. I thanked her. She said, "Of course," and went back inside. I didn't know what had been said in that kitchen. I didn't ask. By day 3, we had something resembling a rhythm. She kept me supplied. I kept her updated. We talked about the roof, the way people talk about something neutral when they're both aware there might be other topics available but haven't agreed to go there. It was easy in a way I hadn't expected. She was direct. Didn't fill silence unnecessarily. Didn't ask questions she didn't actually want the answers to. These are qualities I find rare and disproportionately attractive in people. The coffee appeared on day 4. Real mug. Left on the top step of the ladder before I arrived. Still warm when I got there. No note, no announcement. I drank it and kept working. The next morning there was another one. I didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. We both pretended this was a perfectly ordinary thing that required no acknowledgement, which is how you do something meaningful when you're both too careful to call it that out loud. Jade left Sunday afternoon. I saw her load the car from the roof. She looked up once before she got in, and I got the distinct impression that whatever conclusion she'd reached about me over the weekend was not a favorable one. The car pulled out. Lola stood in the driveway for a moment, after it turned the corner, one hand on the gate, looking at something I couldn't see from my angle. Then she looked up at me. "How's the flashing coming?" she asked. "Good," I said. She nodded and went inside. That evening, she came out to the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea while I was packing up my tools. She sat on the top step and handed me the second glass when I came down. And we watched the neighbor across the street lose an argument with his garden hose in companionable silence. She didn't explain the iced tea. I didn't ask about Jade. We just sat there while the light went gold and the neighborhood settled into evening, and I thought, this is surprisingly comfortable for 2 people who don't know each other. I went home at 7:30, made dinner, stood at my kitchen window and looked at the lit square of hers across the driveway. I want to be accurate about what I was feeling, which is this. I was not falling for my neighbor. I was noticing her. There is a difference. One of them is manageable. I was, at this stage, still operating under the impression that I was in the manageable category. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't find out for another 11 days. And in the meantime, there was a roof to finish, and a mug of coffee waiting on the top step of my ladder every morning, and I had made a decision, somewhere around day 4, to stop pretending I wasn't looking forward to it. The flashing section I found on day 9 was not manufactured. I want to state that clearly, for the record, because I am aware of how it looks. The job extending just as we'd started having actual conversations. The materials requiring a special order. The timeline suddenly becoming elastic. I have receipts. The flashing was genuinely compromised. I did not invent a reason to stay. I did, however, stop fighting the fact that I wanted to. That's different. I'm an electrician. I've been doing this for 9 years, and I have never once rearranged a job timeline for sentimental reasons. But I caught myself, on day 10, hoping the material delivery would be delayed, and that felt like data I should probably pay attention to. Day 11 it rained. I came down off the roof and ended up at her kitchen table waiting for it to clear, and that was the first time I'd been inside the house. It was full of plants, not chaotically, but purposefully, placed the way someone places things when they've thought about where the light lands at different hours. I noticed this, and then noticed I was noticing it, which told me something I wasn't entirely ready to hear. She made tea. Not the bag in a microwave mug version. Real tea, kettle, timer, the kind of tea that communicates that someone has opinions and the patience to act on them. She told me about her work. Landscape architecture, 15 years, a waiting list. I told her about mine. Electrical, 9 years, solo operation since I was 26. She said, "There's dignity in building something that's yours." And she meant it without condescension, which is harder than it sounds. Jade came home during the rain. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me sitting at her mother's table with the expression of someone encountering a variable they had not approved. She said hi to Lola, bypassed me entirely, went upstairs. Lola refilled my mug and asked if I'd always worked independently. The conversation continued. I appreciated that she didn't perform an apology she didn't owe me. The rain stopped. I didn't immediately go back up. Instead, I helped her repot a bird of paradise that had outgrown its container, which required both of us on the kitchen floor with newspaper and potting mix, and a genuine disagreement about root spacing that she won. Getting your hands dirty next to someone is a fast way to establish a certain kind of comfort. I'm not sure I'd recommend it if you're trying to maintain professional distance. I was, at this point, no longer trying very hard. Inside jokes appeared around day 13. The hardware store employee who had given us 3 contradictory pieces of advice across 2 visits. The neighbor and his garden hose, now a recurring character. Small references that only landed because of accumulated context. The kind you don't build with someone in less than 2 weeks, unless something is happening that neither of you has officially named. Jade was quieter that second week, when she was home. A deliberate quiet, not absence but presence with the warmth turned off. I understood it. She was 20 and watching something unfold that she hadn't been consulted about, and her options were limited, and she was choosing the one that kept the peace while still communicating her position. I'd have done the same thing at 20. I probably would have done it less gracefully. On Thursday of week 2, Lola brought me water in the afternoon and stood at the base of the ladder while I worked, which she didn't usually do. She didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then she said, "Jade worries." I said I'd gathered that. She said, "She's not wrong to." I kept working. I said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. She went back inside. I stayed on the roof thinking about the particular honesty of a woman who will tell you the thing that makes her situation more complicated without being asked to. That evening, I sat in my driveway for a while after I got home, which is something I do when I need to think and don't want to be inside. The light in Lola's kitchen was on. I could see the shadow of plants on the window. I sat there until it went off, and then I went inside, and I made dinner. And I did not examine too closely why I'd been sitting in a driveway watching a kitchen window for 20 minutes. Some questions are better answered after the fact. She caught me on a Thursday afternoon. I was loading leftover materials into my truck, end of day, when I heard the front door open and looked up to find Jade walking toward me with the careful pace of someone who has decided to do something and is not going to let momentum talk her out of it. I've seen that walk before. I finished loading the panel I was holding and waited. She stopped a few feet away and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "How much longer is this going to take?" I told her, waiting on final inspection, probably 2 more days. She nodded like that wasn't really what she'd come to ask. Then she said, "My mom has been through a lot. The divorce, starting over. She doesn't need things getting complicated." I stopped moving. I turned and looked at her. Jade had her mother's posture, and what I was beginning to recognize as her mother's directness, but deployed with the urgency of someone who hasn't yet learned how much energy that costs over time. I recognized it because I'd been that person once, certain that if I just said the right thing clearly enough, I could prevent bad outcomes. You get older, and you learn you can't, and it's a hard lesson. "I'm fixing her roof," I said. Flat, not defensive. She looked at me. "I know that's what you're doing." Then her voice dropped slightly and she said, "She doesn't show it when something is getting to her. She's good at seeming fine." That was not the sentence I had been expecting. I'd been prepared for an accusation. What I got instead was information, offered by someone who loved her mother and was scared, and that was harder to know what to do with. I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't have sounded like either a dismissal or a promise I had no business making. She held eye contact for another second, then went back inside. I stood by my truck for a moment before I finished loading. The afternoon had gotten quiet. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. I drove home and sat in my own driveway and thought about what she'd said. Not the protective part that I'd expected. The other part. She's good at seeming fine. Which meant Jade had, at some point, watched her mother not be fine. which meant Lola had a history of absorbing things without showing them, and her daughter knew it and was scared of watching it happen again. That's not a warning. That's a person telling you something real, because they don't have any other move. I went back the next morning. The roof wasn't finished. That was true, and also not the whole reason, and I was starting to be honest with myself about the gap between those two things. Jade was at the kitchen table when Lola let me in. We made eye contact. The entire conversation from the previous evening compressed into approximately 1 second of mutual acknowledgement. Then we both moved on. Lola poured coffee. She looked between us once with the alert attention of someone who has identified a weather system and is deciding whether to mention it. She didn't. She asked me about the inspection timeline. The morning proceeded, but the temperature in the room had shifted in a way I could feel without being able to point to. Jade was careful in a new way, not hostile, just precise, like she was measuring her words before she used them. Lola was steady in the particular way of someone who is holding two things simultaneously and has decided not to let either one drop. I drank my coffee and talked about underlayment and tried to be a person who was just fixing a roof. I was not entirely successful, but I was trying, which I think counts for something. Possibly not enough, depending on who you ask. If you asked Jade at that particular moment, I suspect the answer would have been, no, trying does not count for enough. She would have been 20 and correct, and also missing about 15 years of context that would have changed her answer. We were all, in our various ways, doing our best with what we had. The next morning, Lola came out with coffee and the expression of someone who had made a decision overnight to be fine and was executing on it. I took the coffee. We talked about the inspection. It was a normal morning, and it felt like something held slightly too tightly. I went up on the roof and let her have whatever she was managing. Around 10, I came down for a drill bit and found Jade at the bottom of the steps. She'd been waiting. I could tell by the way she was standing, that particular stillness of someone who has been there long enough to rehearse and unrehearse what they were going to say. She looked at me and said, "I told her I didn't like you coming here every day. We argued about it." Just like that. No preamble, no softening. I said, "I know." She said, "She defended you." And the way she said it, not angry, not accusatory, just honest in the way that cost something, told me that this had surprised her. That she had expected her mother to do something else, and Lola hadn't, and Jade was still working out what that meant. I didn't have anything useful to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I picked up my drill bit and went back up the roof. I thought about it all afternoon. She defended you. Not. She said you were just fixing the roof. Not. She told me to be polite. She defended me. Which means there was something to defend. Which means Lola had said something that acknowledged whatever was building between us, even if she hadn't named it. I sanded a section of flashing and thought about what it costs a person like Lola to say a thing like that to her daughter. She showed up at my door at 9:15 that night. Bottle of Merlot. Both hands. The specific body language of someone who has talked herself into something and is arriving before she can talk herself back out. She said she wanted to apologize for whatever Jade had said. I told her she didn't need to. She said she knew, but she wanted to. I let her in. We sat at my kitchen table with the wine and 2 mismatched glasses and the particular atmosphere of a conversation that is doing 2 things at once. On the surface, she was apologizing for her daughter. Underneath, something else entirely. Something neither of us was going to address directly that night, but which was present in the room the way humidity is present before a storm. Not visible, but felt. She told me about the divorce. The abbreviated version, the one you offer when you're testing whether someone handles things carefully. Her ex-husband had been a decent person until he wasn't, and the transition had been slow enough that she'd doubted her own read of it for longer than she should have. Jade had been 16. She said it plainly, without performance, and I listened the same way. Not filling silence with sympathy she hadn't asked for, just receiving it. I told her about the relationship I'd ended 2 years ago, because I'd confused being low maintenance with being emotionally available, and those are not the same thing. She listened without trying to reframe it for me, which is the right response, and not everyone's instinct. We finished the wine. The conversation wound down into the quiet that comes after two people have said real things and don't need to fill the space afterward. Past 11. She stood to leave. At the door she said, "For what it's worth, I think you're good with her. She just doesn't know it yet." I said, "Neither do I, honestly." She smiled, a real one, wider than her usual register, and went home across 12 feet of driveway. I didn't clean up right away. I sat at the kitchen table for a while with the two mismatched glasses still there. The window above my sink looks directly at her kitchen window. Her light was on. I sat there until it went off, and then I washed the glasses, and I went to bed, and I did not pretend to myself that I was sleeping easily. Some nights, the thing you're trying not to think about is louder than everything else combined. The inspector signed off on a Friday morning, shook my hand, and left. I stood in Lola's driveway, looking up at a finished roof, and felt the specific deflation of a completed job that had turned into something I hadn't budgeted for emotionally. The tiles were solid. The flashing was sealed. The plywood was dry and treated, and would hold for another 20 years. There was nothing left to fix. Lola came out when she heard the inspector leave. She looked up at the roof, then at me. "All done," I said yes. "Good," she said. A pause arrived and stayed. Then, "What do I owe you?" The practical question, the one that converts 3 weeks of early mornings and kitchen floors and mismatched wine glasses into a transaction. I told her the material costs. She wrote a check. I folded it into my pocket. We stood there in the driveway with the finished roof above us, and nothing left to use as a reason to be in the same place. I picked up my toolbox. She crossed her arms, not defensive, just cold, the morning air still sharp. "Thank you," she said. "The heavier version, the one with weight in it." "Of course," I said. I loaded my truck. I drove home. I made lunch and ate it standing at the kitchen counter and tasted none of it. I was staring at my wall at 2 p.m. when my phone rang. I looked at the name and sat with the very specific feeling of someone who has been waiting for something and is now not entirely sure they're ready for it to arrive. I answered. She said, "I was going to ask if you'd like to come for dinner Saturday, as a real thank you, not the check." I said yes before I fully processed the question. She said 7 o'clock and hung up. I replayed the conversation twice to make sure I'd heard it right. Jade was there on Saturday. I had not known this. I suspect Lola had, which was either a strategic decision or the universe's way of keeping things honest. Jade was polite with the precise, deliberate politeness of someone doing it as an act of love for their parent, rather than any personal inclination toward me. I understood this and respected it, and ate the best lamb ragu I'd had in years, while trying not to let my appreciation for the food become too visible. We talked about Jade's program, urban planning, which Lola found logical and faintly ironic. Jade let herself laugh once at this, a real laugh, and something in the room adjusted. After dinner, Jade went upstairs with a project. Lola and I did the dishes. This is, I have since concluded, an underrated activity for two people who are figuring each other out. Just coordinated enough to require proximity. Just routine enough to drop the performance of it. At some point, she handed me a bowl, and her hand didn't quite withdraw before mine arrived, and neither of us said anything about it. But neither of us was not aware of it either. That's a double negative, and I mean it precisely. We were both aware. We were both choosing, in that moment, not to make it into something we'd have to address yet. There's a particular kind of restraint that isn't avoidance. It's more like saving something for when you're ready to do it properly. Porch afterward. She had tea. I had the last of the wine, and we talked about everything except the thing we were both thinking about. which is a skill she had, and I was learning. At 11, she mentioned an early client call. I said of course, and stood to go. At the door, she said, "I'm glad the roof needed fixing. 3 weeks of mornings on a ladder and coffee on the top step and a kitchen floor and 2 mismatched glasses compressed into one sentence." I said, "Me too." I was unlocking my door when her voice came from the porch. "Same time next week?" I turned around. She was at the railing, backlit by the porch light, and she said it with the careful casualness of someone who has thought about how to phrase a thing. "Same time next week," I said. I went inside. I stood in my dark kitchen and did something embarrassing that I will not describe in detail except to say it involved smiling at no one in particular for longer than was dignified. I turned on the lights eventually, made tea I didn't drink, looked at the window. Her light was on. I thought about 12 feet of driveway, and how a distance that had meant nothing for 6 months had become, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, the most significant stretch of geography in my life. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in days. The roof was finished. Something else had just started.
Hey guys and gals, Lena here. Quick pause tack. If this story has already won you over, my Patreon is full of others just like it. Original romances with longer chapters, deeper scenes, and more of those quiet moments that make these stories worth telling. Different women, different complications, the same emotional honesty. Check it out right below.
The following Saturday was different in one specific way. Jade was at a friend's. Lola mentioned this in a text that morning. Saturday still good? Jade's out. Stated as information, not implication, and I read it as both. I texted back still good, and then put my phone down and went back to what I was doing, which was sitting very still thinking about what I was doing. She made pasta. I brought wine. We had been in each other's spaces enough times by now that the first 10 minutes, the settling in, the finding of glasses, the where do you want me, had gotten easy. Her kitchen at 7 on a Saturday felt familiar in a way that I had not given it permission to feel, which I was learning was not really how permission worked. We talked through dinner. Her client with the water feature. A job I'd finished that week. A rewire on a Victorian that had kept me problem-solving for 3 days in a row. The easy back and forth of two people who have established that they find each other interesting and are no longer pretending otherwise. The candles she'd lit had burned down an inch. The wine was most of the way gone. We were mid-sentence about something I can't now recall when she stopped. Just stopped. Put down her glass. Looked at me with an expression that had none of her usual containment in it, just directness, the unguarded kind that takes a second to recognize because you're not used to seeing it from her. She said, "I want to say something, and I need you to know I've thought about it." I said, "Okay." She said, "I don't do any of this easily. Having someone in my house, dinners, whatever this is. I'm telling you that so you understand what it means that I keep doing it." I said, "I know what it means." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she leaned across the table and kissed me. Unhurried, deliberate. The way you do something you've been thinking about long enough that when it happens you don't need to rush it. It was brief. It was also the most considered thing anyone had ever done in my direction, and I have thought about it more times than I can count. She pulled back, not away, just back. Her hand was near mine on the table. She said, "Jade." I said, "I know." We sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the street was doing its ordinary Saturday night things. The candles were down to about 2 inches. Neither of us moved. "This doesn't have to be complicated," I said, which wasn't entirely true but was the most useful thing I could offer in that moment. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "You've met my daughter." "I have," I said. "She's protecting you." "I know," Lola said, and she said it with a softness that told me she was not annoyed by this. That she held Jade's protectiveness the way you hold something that costs you something and you choose anyway. I told her I wasn't asking her to move fast, or sideline her daughter, or make any decision she wasn't ready to make. That I'd been paying attention long enough to know what I was in for, and I was still here. She listened to all of this without interrupting, which is one of the things about her. She gives words the space they need. Then she said, "Okay," in the tone she uses when something is decided. I left at midnight. She walked me to the door, and we stood at the threshold in the way of people who are not quite ready to be in different rooms. "Same time next week?" she said. I smiled. "Same time next week." I walked home. I sat in my kitchen with the lights off for a while, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting in it the way you sit in something that has finally become what you suspected it was going to be all along. Her kitchen light was still on when I looked. It went off about an hour later. I went to bed. I'm not going to try to describe what I felt, except to say that it was the uncomplicated version of something that was going to get significantly more complicated. And in that hour I didn't know the second part yet, and it was very good not to know it. We didn't name it. This was a mutual and unspoken agreement of the kind that forms when two people are both careful enough to know that naming something too early is a way of breaking it. She texted in the mornings. I texted back. Saturdays became ours, and sometimes Wednesdays when the weeks were long, and once, memorably, a Tuesday, no explanation required. We went to a farmer's market at 7 a.m. and disagreed about heirloom tomatoes, and I bought them anyway, and she was right, and mentioned it once, which showed tremendous restraint. To the neighborhood, we were still just neighbors. This is easier than it sounds. People see what they expect, and no one expected us. Lola was the landscape architect with the thoughtful garden. I was the one with the truck and the toolbox. We had overlapping parking situations occasionally. That's what anyone watching would have clocked. Nobody was watching very hard. Jade came home every other weekend. On those weekends we didn't have dinner, and this was also unspoken, and I didn't chafe against it because it wasn't a condition being imposed on me. It was a woman trying to do right by her daughter and by herself at the same time, which is genuinely difficult, and I was not going to make it harder. I had things to do. I had a job and a house and a driveway and a kitchen window that looked at hers, and that was enough for the Jade weekends. But Jade noticed things. A mug I'd left once. A book on the counter she recognized from something I'd mentioned in passing. I didn't know she'd noticed until Lola told me later. At the time, I only knew that when we crossed paths on the driveway, Jade's politeness had sharpened into something that felt less like warmth and more like accuracy. She was cataloging. I couldn't blame her. On a Wednesday evening in the middle of all of this, Lola showed up at my door instead of me going to hers. She had the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for several hours and has decided that putting it down is more urgent than choosing where. Jade had called that afternoon. Normal call, school, logistics, and then at the end, "Are you seeing someone?" And Lola had said, "What makes you ask?" which is technically a question but functions as a yes. And Jade had said okay and let it go. And Lola had stood in her kitchen for 20 minutes before walking across the driveway. "She knows," Lola said. "I made tea." "She might," I said, which is different from having to deal with it. She held the mug with both hands and looked into it. "She'll come home this weekend." "I know." "What do you want to do?" She looked up. "I don't want to hide you," she said, "but I also don't want to ambush her." These are not contradictory positions. They're just hard to hold at the same time. We didn't land on a plan, because the plan depended on Jade, who wasn't in the room. What we landed on was, she would decide when, and I would be ready. And in the meantime, I would continue being a person she could trust with the in-between. I could do that. I'm good at in-betweens. I've spent most of my professional life in spaces that are mid-repair, functional but not finished, and I know how to be steady in them. I walked her home. We stood at her door. She said, "Thank you for not making this simpler than it is." I said, I didn't know how to do that anyway, which is true. She kissed me goodnight, brief and certain, and went inside. I stood on her porch for a second longer than necessary, looking at the street, then walked back across 12 feet of driveway thinking about the phrase, not making this simpler than it is. That is, I think, the best thing anyone has ever thanked me for. The next morning, the coffee was on my porch step. Not on a ladder, just there, on the step, in the real mug. I found it at 7 when I went out. I stood in the early light holding it and looked at the roof across the driveway. Solid, whole, weatherproofed. It had needed fixing. We'd fixed it. Everything that came after was its own thing entirely. I texted her. Coffee received. She texted back. Good. That's the whole exchange. I've thought about it an unreasonable number of times. The trip was Lola's idea, framed as practical necessity, which is how she frames most things that matter. She had a client consultation in Asheville, a residential property she needed to walk before committing to the scope. She'd been planning to go alone, drive up Friday, stay the night, drive back Sunday. Then she texted me, "Would you want to come? I could use the company on the drive." I said yes. I rearranged 2 Saturday jobs. She noted that I'd done this. I told her she should note it. She sent back a single period, which from Lola constitutes a full emotional response. We left Friday afternoon, 4 hours to Asheville. We'd been in each other's spaces before, but always in a space that belonged to one of us. Always with the option to go home, always with a kitchen or a porch as the container. The car was different. Just us, moving through space that belonged to neither of us, with nothing to do but be in it. She had a playlist. I had snacks. We established territory in the first 20 minutes and then stopped needing to, because we had essentially the same taste, which felt like the universe making a point. She talked through the client project for the first hour. Sloping lot, drainage issues, clients with strong opinions about a water feature that wasn't going to work where they wanted it. She talked the way she thought. Aloud, precise, not looking for agreement, just working through it. I know that mode. I use it myself. There's something particular about being with someone who processes the same way you do. You can follow the thinking without being asked to validate each step. Somewhere in the second hour, the conversation shifted. Off the client, into things that don't come up naturally when there's a house nearby to retreat to. She told me about the first year after the divorce. Not the emotional version, the logistical one. What it had taken to make the finances work. To unwind a life that had been built around someone else's framework. She said it evenly, in the same tone she uses for everything, and I heard what was underneath it. That it had been genuinely hard, and she had done it anyway, and she was not looking for acknowledgement of this. Just saying it because we were 4 hours from home, and it was true. I told her about the years I spent mistaking self-sufficiency for self-knowledge. She said, I did that too, and we didn't elaborate because we didn't need to. 2 people who have separately learned the same hard thing don't need to compare notes. They just need to know the other person has the notes. The hotel was a narrow Victorian with creaking floors and a garden view, and the specific smell of old wood and good cleaning products. She'd booked 2 rooms. I hadn't asked and she hadn't explained, and it was exactly right. We had dinner at a place she'd researched. Small room, weekly menu, the kind of restaurant that takes itself seriously without making you feel the pressure of that. The food was good. I couldn't tell you what I ordered. After dinner, we walked. Asheville at night is the kind of city that makes walking feel like the right speed for everything. Lit galleries, music drifting from somewhere, streets that feel like they've been broken in by a lot of people who needed to think. At some point, she reached over and took my hand. No announcement, no check-in. Just, here is my hand. Here is where I am. This is happening. We walked for an hour. I wasn't measuring distance. I was paying attention to other things. We stopped in front of a bookshop that was closed but still lit inside. She turned to face me and said, "I want to say something I haven't said out loud before." I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm happy when I'm with you. Not comfortable, not relieved, happy. Those are different things, and I'd stopped expecting the last one." I held her hand and didn't say anything immediately, because some things need a second before you answer them. Then I said, "I know exactly what you mean." And I kissed her in front of that closed bookshop, and she kissed me back, and the city continued around us without caring, and I found that very agreeable. She slept for an hour on the drive home Sunday, her head tilted toward the window. I drove in the quiet and thought about how a person can change the quality of a space just by being in it. How 4 hours in a car had felt like more than a lot of months I could name. The playlist ended, and I didn't restart it. I let it be quiet. She slept. The highway stretched out ahead. I drove. She texted me on a Friday. "Jade's home this weekend. I think I'm going to tell her." I sat with that for a minute before I responded, landed on, "I'm here if you need anything." She said, "I know." That's a full conversation from Lola. I understood every word. I didn't hear anything that evening. I hadn't expected to. Whatever was happening in that house was between the two of them, and my place in it was exactly what Lola decided it was, and not a degree more. I made dinner. I put on something to watch, and watched none of it. I went to bed, and lay there listening to the neighborhood sounds, and told myself that whatever was going to happen was going to happen, and I couldn't manage it from across 12 feet of driveway. Lola called at 9:45. Her voice had the careful steadiness of someone who has been steady on purpose for several hours. She said it hadn't gone well. Jade had been calm, and then not calm, and the not calm part had included things that were true, and things that were fear in disguise, and all of it had been hard to sit with. She said Jade had cried. She said she had also cried, and she told me that the way you report a fact that cost you something to report. "Do you want me to come over?" I asked. "No," she said. "I need to be here with her." I said I understood. A pause. Then, "She asked me if I was sure about you." I didn't say anything. "I told her yes," Lola said. "I didn't sleep much. Saturday morning. I stayed home, did things that needed doing, kept my phone nearby. Around 11, someone knocked. I opened the door, and Jade was on my porch in a university sweatshirt, holding her own coffee, no particular expression on her face. She said, "Can I talk to you?" I said yes. I stepped back. She came in. She stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where her mother and I had shared wine that first night, which Jade didn't know and I was aware of, and looked around briefly the way you do in an unfamiliar space. Then she looked at me and said, "I don't want to not like you. I want you to know that. Not liking someone takes a lot of energy, and I don't think you've actually done anything." This was possibly the most precisely delivered compliment I've ever received. I told her that her instinct to protect her mother was one of the better things about her. She blinked. She'd come prepared for a different kind of conversation. "She doesn't always show when she's struggling," Jade said. I said I'd gathered that. "She's been happy lately," she said. And she said it like she was presenting evidence, waiting to see what I did with it. "I'm glad," I said. She looked at me for another beat and then looked at her coffee and said, "Just don't mess it up." Then she left. Didn't finish the coffee. I stood in my kitchen for a minute after the door closed. Breathed. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a blessing. It was just a 20-year-old leaving a door slightly open that she'd been holding shut. That mattered to me more than I'd expected it to. Lola texted. "She told me she went to see you." I confirmed. "What did you say?" I typed out an answer, deleted it, typed, "The truth." She took a moment, then, "Thank you." That evening, she and Jade had dinner together, just the two of them. I ordered takeout and ate it on my couch and felt entirely fine about it. Some evenings belong to other people. Knowing that, not resenting it, is its own kind of thing. 3 months. Not long, by most measurements. By the measurement of what had happened inside it, it felt like a different unit entirely. Denser, more weighted, the kind of time that accumulates significance faster than the calendar accounts for. 3 months ago, I had been a person who lived next door to a woman I barely knew. The driveway between our houses was 12 feet and might as well have been a different city. Jade texted me the Thursday before she came home for a long weekend in late October. Not Lola, me. She asked if I liked peach cobbler. I said yes. Saturday morning, a dish of it appeared on my porch step. No knock. The same way her mother had once left coffee on the top step of a ladder. I found it when I went out for the paper and stood in the early light holding it and felt something I didn't immediately have a word for, close enough to grateful. Bigger than relief. The 3 of us had dinner that Saturday. No occasion. Just Lola's kitchen and a meal she'd been planning since Tuesday, and Jade arriving late and still in her coat when she sat down. We talked about Jade's thesis, about a difficult client of Lola's, about whether the Japanese maple was going to survive the winter. I took a position on the maple. Jade agreed with me. Lola made the face she makes when she's outvoted and is performing more affront than she feels. Jade and I exchanged a look. It was a small moment, ordinary, the kind you don't recognize as the thing you've been waiting for until you're already inside it. Jade kissed her mom on the cheek when she left and paused at the door and said to me specifically, "Next time I want to hear the whole story about the roof." Then she was out. Lola looked at the closed door and then at me with an expression I didn't have a name for, but recognized. The particular relief of someone who has been holding 2 things that mattered and has just felt them stop pulling against each other. We did the dishes. This had become one of our things by this point. Me washing, her drying, her directing me to cabinets I still didn't have memorized. She handed me a glass and pointed with her chin, and I reached past her to put it away. And the proximity was ordinary, and not ordinary at once, the way it always was. I don't think that quality ever goes away entirely. I'm not sure I'd want it to. Sunday morning, I was in my driveway running a diagnostic on my truck when I heard something on the roof. Looked up. A branch from the oak at the property line had come down overnight and caught the gutter. Minor. 20 minutes of work, a section of hardware. Nothing I hadn't done before. I stood there a moment and felt the specific satisfaction of a person looking at something broken and knowing exactly what to do about it. Lola's kitchen window opened. She looked out, saw me, followed my gaze up to the gutter. "What is it?" "Gutter," I said. "The branch." She assessed it the way she assessed everything, quickly, without drama. "Do you need the ladder?" "I have mine." She disappeared from the window. 2 minutes later, she came out with coffee. She stood at the base of my ladder and held it up, the same way I had once stood at the base of hers. I took it. I drank it on the ladder before I started, looking out over the neighborhood from 12 feet up. The same view I'd had all those weeks ago when this was just a job. It looked the same and completely different. That's not the roof. That's me. When I came down, she was sitting on her porch step with her own mug, watching the street. I sat on the lower step. Same positions as that first evening with the iced tea, when neither of us knew what any of this was going to become. The neighbor across the street was at it again with his garden hose, losing with great conviction. We watched him for a while without commenting, which felt right. Then Lola said, "I'm glad the storm came." I turned and looked at her. She was looking at the street, expression easy, the small smile she allows when something is true and she's decided to say it out loud. "Me too," I said. I meant all of it. The storm and the roof and the 3 weeks and the coffee and Asheville and the peach cobbler and Jade's text and 12 feet of driveway that had turned into the most significant geography of my adult life. Some things show up as minor inconveniences. The worthwhile ones, you stop trying to fix them and start being glad they happened.